The concrete steps leading down to the boiler room of the Mount Hood Sanatorium had been hollowed out by 80 years of heavy, oil-slicked boots. Every evening at dusk, when the Oregon rain turned from a steady drizzle into a dense, vertical wall of gray water, the cold would creep down those steps like a physical presence. My job was to keep that cold from reaching the wards upstairs, but the dampness of the mountain seemed to seep through the very pores of the foundation, settling in the marrow of my bones before I even reached the bottom landing. The air in the sub-basement was thick, smelling of sulfur, wet soot, and the bitter, oily tang of No. 2 diesel fuel that pooled in the shallow concrete catch basins. Two massive, iron-hulled boilers, cast in Pennsylvania in the early 1920s, dominated the room like sleeping iron beasts. Their black flanks, bolted together with rivets the size of my fist, were encrusted with decades of baked-on grease and mineral scale. My fingers, permanently stained with carbon and engine oil, adjusted the brass air intake valve on boiler number 1. The burner roared to life with a deep, muffled rumble that vibrated through the soles of my work boots, sending a heavy shudder up the main steam line. The system was ancient, a sprawling network of gravity-return steam lines that circulated boiling water through miles of heavy copper pipes buried deep within the sanatorium's 3-foot-thick concrete walls. When the steam rose, the copper expanded, producing a series of heavy, metallic groans that echoed through the empty corridors of the basement. To the nurses on the upper floors, it was just the sound of the old building breathing in its sleep. To me, it was a mechanical checklist of thermal expansion and pressure differentials. I sat down at my wooden workbench, pulling a worn ledger toward me under the yellow, flickering glow of a wire-caged bulb. The rain outside struck the high, narrow coal chute windows with a flat, rhythmic percussion, a steady drumming that usually masked the minor groans of the facility. I began logging the evening pressure readings, my pencil scratching dryly against the yellowed paper, 20 pounds per square inch on the main header, normal draft, flue gas temperature holding steady at 400 degrees. Then, the first anomaly showed itself on the analog pressure gauge of boiler number 2. The brass needle, covered by a cracked, grease-smeared glass face, was trembling. It didn't rise with the steady, predictable climb of increasing steam volume. It twitched violently, jumping 3 pounds to the right, then falling back to 0, before spiking again in a frantic, irregular rhythm. I stood up, my boots making a soft, sticky sound on the damp concrete floor. The fuel valve to number 2 was shut tight, the firebox had been dark and empty since Tuesday's maintenance cycle. There was no fire in its belly, and no water being heated in its iron tubes. From deep within the wall behind my workbench, where the main return line disappeared into the dark masonry, came a sound. It wasn't the slow, dull expansion groan of hot metal meeting cold air. It was a sharp, localized impact, completely distinct from the natural respiration of the system. A single, metallic strike. Clang. I stopped breathing, my hand still holding the heavy iron pipe wrench. The sound was clear, heavy, and far too rhythmic to be a pocket of trapped air clearing a radiator valve. After a long 5 seconds of silence, it came again, louder this time, radiating from the copper elbow joint 3 feet above my head. Asterisk clang. Clang, asterisk. I reached out, my calloused palm hovering an inch away from the pipe. The metal was cold to the touch, yet the vibration of the impact was strong enough to make the dust on the pipe support bracket dance in the dim light. It felt as if someone were standing on the other side of the concrete wall, wielding a small hammer, striking the copper with a deliberate, desperate intent. The vibration traveled up the line, a sharp pulse that echoed through the entire sub-basement. I pressed my ear closer to the cold copper, and through the metal, I didn't hear the rush of water. I heard a faint, bubbling hiss, a sound that rose and fell like a dry, shallow breath struggling to draw oxygen through a wet cloth. The needle on the dead boiler's gauge twitched once more, pinning itself briefly against the red line before dropping back down, leaving me alone in the damp chill of the room. The midnight shift was always the quietest, but tonight the silence felt heavy, suffocatingly pressurized by the vicious storm that raged against the jagged Oregon pines outside. The sanatorium above me was an abyss of shadows, dark, save for the dim, sickly yellow emergency lights in the tuberculosis wards. Up there, 70 patients lay trapped in iron beds, their shallow, wet, rattling breaths kept unnaturally warm by the scalding, tainted steam I sent up through the rotting walls. I could hear the faint, collective sigh of the building's massive, rusted radiators, a soft, dry, and mocking whistling that usually brought a sense of mechanical order to the night. But tonight, that order felt fragile, torn apart by the biting, necrotic cold draft that kept whistling through the jagged cracks in the coal chute windows like the breath of a corpse. I was cleaning the burner nozzles at the workbench when the vibration started again, a tremor that felt like the earth itself was shuddering. This time, it wasn't a single strike. It was a sequence, a sharp, metallic, and predatory rhythm that seemed to rise from the very depths of the cracked floorboards beneath my feet. Asterisk clang. Clang clang. Clang asterisk. The pattern was deliberate, an agonizing, countdown-like rhythm. It stopped, waited for exactly 3 seconds of unbearable suspense, and then repeated itself in the exact same cold, calculated cadence. I stood up, the brass nozzle slipping from my sweat-slicked hand and hitting the concrete floor with a sharp, piercing ring that echoed off the cavernous, tomb-like iron holes of the boilers. I walked slowly toward the central distribution header, where the main copper risers branched off into the walls of the eastern wing like veins in a flayed corpse. The air around the junction grew impossibly thick, smelling faintly of ancient, crumbling plaster and stagnant, rusty water that tasted of iron and decay. I pressed my ear against the freezing, weeping metal of the return line. The vibration didn't originate from the basement, it was traveling downward from the upper floors, carried through the water columns inside the pipes like a scream moving through glass. Through the copper, I could hear a faint, wet, and sickening rushing sound, not the smooth, continuous flow of condensation, but a turbulent, bubbling gurgle, like putrid water being forced through a very narrow, restricted, and constricted opening. And beneath that liquid, gurgling rush, there was a whisper. It didn't sound like a human voice. It was a mechanical, hollow imitation of one, a soft, sibilant, and demonic hissing of steam escaping through a loose, jagged packing nut. But the hissing had a distinct, unnatural, and sentient rhythm, rising and falling in perfect synchronization with the rhythmic strikes on the copper. It sounded like a dry, desperate, and dying intake of air, followed by a long, wet, rattling exhale that vibrated through the metal and straight into my marrow. It was the sound of a pair of ruined, collapsed lungs, clearing themselves of thick, black fluid, projected through miles of hollow copper tubing. I reached for the manual bypass valve on the return line, intending to drain the loop and clear whatever stubborn air pocket was causing the noise. As my fingers closed around the cold, slick iron wheel, the needle on the adjacent temperature indicator began to spin violently backward. The temperature of the pipe was dropping rapidly, falling past 50 degrees, then 40, until a thin, white, and rime-covered frost began to spiderweb across the green paint of the copper riser like skeletal fingers. The metal beneath my hand grew so excruciatingly cold that my skin stuck to the wheel, tearing away as I pulled back with a sharp, involuntary gasp, leaving a tiny, smeared smudge of gray, frost-bitten soot on the iron. The cold didn't feel like the natural winter of the mountain outside, it was a dead, chemical, and soul-sucking chill that seemed to leach the moisture right out of my pores, leaving my skin dry and aching. From the floor above, directly in line with the eastern riser, I heard a heavy, muffled, and wet thud. It sounded like a heavy sack of wet, mangled grain being dropped onto the wooden floorboards of the empty, shadowed storage ward. Then, the rhythmic tapping inside the pipe began again, faster this time, frantic, sharp, and violent, vibrating through the concrete floor until the glass jars of joint compound on my shelves began to shatter and rattle against one another in a cacophony of impending doom. The sound was no longer just a vibration, it had become a physical, crushing pulse, beating against the walls of the sub-basement like a trapped, frantic, and monstrous heart clawing its way out of a steel ribcage. By 3 in the morning, the violent storm shattered the main power line along the mountain road, plunging the facility into suffocating, unnatural gloom. The backup generator kicked in with a distant, coughing roar, leaving the sub-basement dimly illuminated by 3 flickering lanterns that cast a sickly light. The shadows cast by the hulking boilers stretched across the damp, weeping ceiling like tar-black limbs that seemed to twist, shift, and reach outward, clawing at my back whenever the lantern stuttered in the icy draft. I stood trembling before the logbook, but I couldn't write. My fingers were locked in rigid, frostbitten rigor mortis. The cold had become a localized, malevolent entity, hovering around the rusted hull of boiler number 2 like an invisible block of deep glacial ice. The air was so dry and freezing that my ragged, panicked breath froze into sharp, glittering crystals, falling silently to the soot-stained floor like the dust of a grave. I decided to trace the eastern riser, a fool's errand born of pure terror. I took my brass flashlight, its trembling beam cutting a dusty yellow path through the stagnant, tomb-like air, and began to climb the narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the utility chase between the first-floor wards and the rotted isolation wing. The walls here were porous concrete, sweating with viscous condensation that dripped from the ceiling with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Every drop that hit the rusted iron steps below sounded like a slow hammer strike, a clock ticking down to my final, agonizing 0. As I climbed, the tapping grew clearer, stripped of the basement's deceptive echoes. It was no longer a distant vibration, it was a rhythmic, violent assault directly behind the drywall of the corridor, as if something trapped inside were desperate to tear its way out through the flesh of the building. I stopped at the access panel for the main steam riser of Ward C, the old tuberculosis ward that had been boarded up since the blood-soaked quarantine of 1948. The brass screws were heavily rusted, their heads choked in a thick, toxic layer of green copper oxidation. I used my pocket knife to force them, the brittle wood screaming and splintering as the panel gave way with a sharp crack, collapsing under the trembling pressure of my shoulder. I shone the flashlight into the claustrophobic wall cavity, my heart hammering a lethal rhythm against my ribs. The 3-inch copper steam line ran vertically through the center of the dark, dusty space. It was covered in crumbling asbestos, but the white wrapping had been torn away in long, jagged strips near the middle, hanging like the shredded bandages of a war victim. The bare copper beneath was not dark and weathered like the rest of the line, it was polished to a sickening sheen, shining as if it had been repeatedly rubbed, scrubbed, and gripped by something soft, moist, and endlessly hungry. The tapping started right in front of my face, a deafening, metallic pounding that shook my skull. Asterisk clang. Clang. Clang, asterisk. The copper pipe vibrated violently, the iron brackets holding it to the concrete studs groaning, twisting, and screaming under sudden, impossible strain. But there was no one in the wall. The space was barely 6 inches wide, hermetically sealed from the floors above and below by thick, monolithic poured concrete fire stops. Then, I saw the condensation on the pipe's surface. The moisture wasn't dripping, it was moving upward against nature, drawing itself into distinct, horizontal, sickeningly human lines that resembled the ridges of stretched, decaying fingertips. 2 pale, wet, translucent outlines of hands appeared on the polished metal, pressing into the copper from the inside, the heavy metal bowing outward slightly under impossible, internal pressure as if something monstrous were trying to squeeze its way through the pipe. From the open utility chase, a sudden, scorching draft of hot, sulfurous, putrid steam blew into my face, smelling of hell itself. It didn't smell of clean boiler water. It carried the distinct, heavy, nauseating odor of charred bone, singed wool, and the unmistakable, Swedish, cloying smell of old, stagnant antiseptics and absolute, liquefying decay. I stumbled backward off the ladder, a cry dying in my throat, my flashlight slipping from my numbed hand and crashing into the pitch-black darkness of the shaft, leaving me in the freezing, utterly blind dark, alone with the sound of the metal groaning under the weight of the thing trapped within. I scrambled back down the spiral stairs in the absolute, crushing dark, my hands sliding along the wet, sweating, and putrid concrete walls until I reached the bottom landing, guided only by the dim, sickly amber emergency glow of the boiler room. My chest was heaving, the hot, sulfurous, and bile-inducing taste of the steam still coating the back of my throat like a thick, greasy film of industrial oil. I ran straight to the main control board, my boots splashing through shallow, tepid puddles of condensation that felt like stagnant bathwater. The analog gauges for boiler number 1, the active, coal-fired beast keeping the upper wards alive, were steady, holding their needles at a safe 15 pounds of pressure. But the gauges for boiler number 2, the long-dead, cursed iron coffin, were spiking into the violent red. The analog pressure needle was pinned hard, trembling violently against the stop pin at 60 pounds per square inch, an impossible, physics-defying reading. This was a nightmare made manifest. The fuel valve was locked, fused by decades of neglect. The firebox was empty, the coal grate was stone cold and covered in a thick, suffocating layer of old, undisturbed ash. There was no source of heat to generate steam, no water flowing through its dead, clogged iron tubes. Yet the boiler's massive, rusted iron hull was creaking, twisting, and screaming under an immense, invisible, and terrifying pressure, the heavy steel rivets along the seams groaning and popping like jagged shrapnel ready to shred my body. I grabbed the heavy, sweat-slicked brass handle of the manual blowdown valve on boiler number 2, intending to vent the impossible pressure into the floor drain before the iron hull ruptured, turning the entire basement into a meat grinder. I threw my entire, desperate weight against the frozen lever. As I pulled, the pipes along the ceiling didn't hiss with the clean release of steam. They let out a long, agonizing, and visceral shriek, a sound like thick, tempered metal being ripped apart by a gargantuan hydraulic press, mixed with a high-pitched, curdling human scream that shattered the glass in my lantern. The sound vibrated through my jawbone, drilling into my ears with a physical, percussive force that made me drop to my knees, blood trickling from my nose. Then, the heavy, slab-like iron door of the dark firebox on boiler number 2 began to vibrate with lethal intensity. The steel latch, thick as my wrist and fused with decades of rust, was lifting. Something from the inside was pushing against the heavy door, a rhythmic, bone-crushing thudding that sounded like a giant throwing its gore-slicked shoulder against the iron plate. Asterisk thud. Thud. Thud, asterisk. With a sharp, metallic snap that sounded like a heavy-caliber gunshot in the tight space, the latch gave way. The heavy door swung open on its rusted hinges with the force of a wrecking ball, slamming against the brick support column with a concussive, wall-shaking impact that sent cracks spiraling through the entire basement floor. No cleansing flames came out of the dark, cavernous opening. Instead, a dense, swirling, and suffocating cloud of white-hot, scalding steam poured from the firebox, rolling across the concrete floor like a slow-moving, radioactive wave. The steam was thick, opaque, and smelling intensely of old, crushed charcoal, burnt, singed hair, and the sickly, sweetish, and nauseating rot of Ward C. It didn't rise to the ceiling, it stayed low, hugging the floor, creeping toward my boots with a sickening, predatory, and sentient deliberation. In the center of the roiling white vapor, a shape began to condense, a nightmarish geometry of hate. It was tall, jagged, and constructed of shifting, razor-sharp layers of gray, freezing mist that seemed to hold their form against the draft of the room. As the steam rolled closer, the temperature in the basement plummeted into a sub-zero abyss, the heat of boiler number 1 vanishing beneath a sudden, biting, and necrotic winter that turned my gasping, panicked breath into jagged crystals of frost. I backed away, my hands scraping against the rough, jagged concrete of the coal bin until they bled. The mist was no longer just steam, it was a physical, tightening mass, weaving itself in the freezing air, and from its shifting, hollow chest, a low, mechanical, and malevolent hum began to pulse, the slow, dual-pulsed heartbeat of the sanatorium, driving the putrid rot of the dead, forgotten wards down into my lonely, suffocating tomb. The cold made the wet leather of my boots contract instantly, the trapped moisture crystallizing into a crackling layer of white ice. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the slick frost until my shoulder blades hit the radiating heat of boiler number 1. The coal burner was roaring right behind me, but the heat felt like a distant, powerless spark against the predatory vacuum of cold radiating from the floor. It actively devoured the heat, pulling warmth straight from my skin and turning my desperate, ragged breaths into thick, heavy plumes of gray ice. The shifting mass of steam from boiler number 2 was rapidly condensing, gaining an impossible, dense geometry in the dim light. It was no longer a loose cloud of vapor. Instead, it was a collection of tight, pressurized white outlines that folded over into themselves, shifting with the precision of wet linen wrung dry by massive, invisible hands. As I watched, paralyzed against the vibrating iron of the active boiler, the vapors constructed the terrifying shape of a towering human torso. The limbs were horribly elongated, stretching toward the concrete pillars like wet canvas pulled under immense tension. Its head was a featureless dome of compressed fog, tilting with a stiff, jointed motion, as if trying to orient itself toward the frantic sound of my racing heartbeat in the darkness. A sound began to vibrate directly out of the creature's shifting, pressurized chest. It was not a voice. It was the mechanical, sibilant roar of the commercial steam presses from the upper laundry room, a heavy, rhythmic hiss-shuck that repeated with a flat, terrifying cadence. But layered beneath that industrial rhythm was a wet, crackling frequency that made my teeth chatter. It was the unmistakable sound of dozens of fluid-filled lungs, a collective, bubbling throat rattle of patients struggling to draw a single breath of dry air through wet sheets. The sound resonated within the copper pipes behind me, multiplying until the vibrating static felt like a physical pressure drilling directly into the bones of my skull. It was the noise of the 64, their choked gasps in the firebox of 1934, compressed into a single, agonizing frequency of white noise. "Who's down there?" The voice shattered the static, cutting through the frozen air from the top of the stairs. It was Miller, the night watchman. I could see the yellow, dust-filled beam of his heavy brass flashlight cutting through the thick sulphurous fog from the landing. He had his heavy wool utility coat pulled tight against his chin, his thick leather boots making a slow, hesitant creak on the wet steps as he tried to peer down into the gloom of the sub-basement. "Don't come down!" I screamed, my voice cracking violently as the freezing air hit my throat, tasting of old ash and copper dust. "Miller, get back up the stairs. Bolt the heavy door. Get out of here." But my warning was completely drowned out by the roaring static of the steam pipes. Miller took another slow step down the stairs, his boots sliding slightly on the condensation-covered wood. He raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room until the light landed directly on the center of the rolling, geometric mist. The moment the light touched the creature's chest, the wet static flared into a high-pitched, drilling whine that made my ears bleed. The elongated, white limbs of vapor erupted outward with an explosive speed that defied gravity. They didn't drift, they shot across the 30-foot gap between the dark boiler and the staircase like pressurized iron cables. The wet, freezing fog wrapped around Miller's legs, drawing tight with a sharp, sickening tension that looked like braided, frozen ropes. I watched in absolute, helpless horror as Miller's heavy brass flashlight slipped from his paralyzed fingers, tumbling down the steps before the glass lens shattered against the stone landing, casting jagged reflections across the concrete. Miller didn't scream. The localized winter of the entity was too fast, too absolute. His mouth opened in a silent gasp for air, but the moisture in his throat froze instantly. A dense, crystalline plume of frost erupted from his lips, his entire body stiffening into a rigid, pale statue of ice in a fraction of a second. The braided ropes of steam didn't release him, they contracted with a wet, heavy snap, dragging his frozen, unyielding weight down the stairs and into the dark throat of the open coal chute. The heavy iron slide of the chute closed with a dull, echoing clang that vibrated through the floorboards. I was left entirely alone in the darkness, the faint, dying flickers of the broken flashlight on the floor slowly fading into the heavy, dual-pulsed thump-thump of the frozen copper pipes. The silence after Miller's descent was worse than the mechanical screaming of pipes. It was a dense, pressurized quiet pressing against my eardrums like deep water. The white mist had snapped back into the dark firebox like an elastic band, leaving only the dying flicker of Miller's flashlight on the concrete. The only light was the amber glow of emergency lanterns, casting trembling shadows across a floor coated in greasy gray silt. It smelled intensely of charred bone, ash, and rot. I dragged myself up, muscles stiff from the localized winter. My hands, raw where the wheel tore my skin, shook as I gripped the iron rail. I scrambled up, boots slipping on thin, crackling ice that coated the metal. Every step felt like an immense struggle against a draft that pulled me backward, toward the gaping maw of the coal chute. When I reached the top landing, I threw my shoulder against the heavy oak door. It didn't budge. The wood was reinforced with iron and bolted firmly from the outside. "Help!" I whispered, my throat too scorched by sulfurous vapor to produce anything louder than a raspy gasp. I slammed my weight against the door, the iron latch rattling mockingly. Through the wire-reinforced glass window, the first-floor corridor was empty. The green night lights flickered, casting skeletal patterns on the linoleum. Up there, 70 patients were sleeping in iron beds, sealed off by 3 feet of concrete. They couldn't hear me. To them, the rhythmic thump-thump was just the building breathing. From the pipe chase behind the stairs, the rhythmic tapping began again. Clang. 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 The impact was closer, vibrating through the structural steel beneath my feet. The copper risers inside the walls were expanding, but not from steam. The temperature in the stairwell was plummeting so fast that my breath froze into a thick fog, obscuring my view. The pipes weren't carrying heat, they were circulating an absolute, administrative cold that split the masonry. I could hear the muffled groans of the foundation as fractures spiderwebbed through the walls. I realized I couldn't stay on the stairs. I had to find a way to vent the system or find the source of the pressure. I descended, eyes locked on the open door of Boiler 2. The firebox was silent, but the silt on the floor was shifting, drawn toward my workbench by a faint, spiraling draft. I walked to the wooden bench, hands trembling as I pulled open the bottom drawer. Beneath a pile of rusted fittings lay the leather-bound registry from the winter of 1934, a relic I had recovered from storage. Its cover was soft, swollen with decades of humidity. I flipped open the brittle pages. The ink was faded, but the records for December were clear. There were no names for the final 3 weeks of the epidemic. There were only columns of numbers, followed by a note in the margin, written in the cramped cursive of the facility director. Ground frozen solid. No grave digging possible. Heavy pressure on the central heating plant. Resolved with the maintenance supervisor to utilize the primary fireboxes of the lower heating plant to clear the backlog and maintain operational temperatures in the recovery wards. 64 units cleared. The scars on my forearms began to throb with phantom heat. They hadn't buried them. The 64 victims had been fed into the iron bellies of the boilers, their remains vaporized into the system that kept the sanatorium warm. For 80 years, their essence had been circulating through the miles of copper tubing, an endless, closed loop of trapped breath and steam. The rhythmic tapping inside the pipe stopped, replaced by a hollow gurgle. Above me, the main steam header vibrated, and a thin, wet hiss escaped from a loose packing nut. A single drop of dark, oily condensation fell, landing on the open page. It didn't soak in, it bubbled, turning into a tiny spiral of mist that smelled of wet charcoal. The transition from that concrete tomb to the blinding white of morning didn't feel like a rescue, it felt like a violent extraction. I don't remember the bolt on the heavy oak door sliding back, or the panicked shouts of the day shift crew when they found me. My last cohesive memory of that night was the smell of boiling charcoal rising from the wet pages of the 1934 registry, and the way the shadows of the boiler seemed to stretch and merge into a single, suffocating canopy of absolute black. When my eyes finally cracked open, the world was sterile, silent, and painfully bright. I was lying in a narrow bed at St. Charles Hospital in Bend, 60 miles away from the damp, pine-choked slopes of Mount Hood. The air in the ward was warm, but it was a synthetic, forced heat that did nothing to thaw the deep, glacial ache settled in the marrow of my bones. My hands were heavily bandaged, wrapped in thick layers of white gauze that made them look like the featureless, swollen limbs of the entity I had faced in the dark. For the first 3 days, I couldn't speak. The sulfurous, freezing steam had scorched my vocal cords, leaving my throat raw and scarred. Every time I tried to form a syllable, only a dry, rattling hiss escaped my lips, a sound that echoed the sibilant whisper of the copper pipes so perfectly that I would choke on my own breath in panic. The doctors told my supervisor it was a textbook case of severe carbon monoxide poisoning. They claimed a cracked flue pipe on boiler number 2 had leaked toxic, odorless gas into the unventilated sub-basement, causing vivid, terrifying hallucinations. It was a neat, professional explanation that satisfied the state inspectors and cleared the sanatorium of liability. They explained Miller's disappearance as a tragic accident. They claimed he must have slipped in the storm, fallen into the flooded ravine behind the facility, and been swept down the mountain. They never searched the coal chute. They didn't want to look. My supervisor visited on the second week, placing my personal belongings on the bedside cabinet. Among my dry clothes and the rusted pocketknife was the leather-bound registry, its corners still singed and smelling faintly of wet soot. He didn't ask why I had taken it. He just wanted to tell me my shifts had been covered, and that I wouldn't be expected back on the mountain. "You look like you've seen a ghost, kid," he muttered, eyes tracking the thick bandages on my hands. "Just get some rest." But rest was an impossibility. Even in the clean, modern hospital, the infrastructure of the civilized world was watching me. I spent my days staring at the pale green privacy curtains that hung around my bed. Whenever the nurse drew them shut, the heavy cotton fabric would fold into sharp, geometric angles that resembled the shifting torso of the vapor. I would lie paralyzed, waiting for the fabric to tighten, waiting for the sibilant hiss-shuck of the laundry presses to rise from the floorboards. The terror peaked at night when the hospital's automatic radiator valves would click open. Through the thin drywall of my room, I could hear the hot water rushing through the building's copper veins. It was a smooth, continuous flow at first, but then the expansion groans would start. Asterisk clang. Clang, asterisk my heart would hammer against my ribs as I pressed my palms against my ears, desperate to drown out the cadence. I knew the rhythm. I knew that somewhere in the basement of this hospital, another boiler was heating another network of pipes, circulating the collective, forgotten breath of 1,000 other souls. On my final night in the clinic, the temperature outside dropped below freezing. I looked toward the window, where a thin layer of frost was beginning to spiderweb across the glass. It wasn't forming in the natural, delicate patterns of winter. The crystals were aligning into straight, horizontal lines, drawing the unmistakable, wet outlines of 2 human hands pressing against the pane from the empty air outside, leaving a faint, gray silt on the ledge. The discharge papers from St. Charles were signed with a shaking hand that barely resembled my own. I didn't return to the mountain. I didn't even return to my apartment in Portland. Instead, I rented a drafty, single-room cabin on the outskirts of Sisters, where the dry desert air of Central Oregon was supposed to be good for damaged lungs. The cabin was primitive, heated only by an old, cast-iron wood stove that sat in the middle of the pine-paneled living room. There were no pipes in the walls, no steam headers, and no gravity return lines to carry the breathing of the dead. For the first month, the dry, pine-scented silence of the high desert was the only medicine that brought any semblance of peace. But the silence was an illusion. The winter of 1976 was one of the coldest on record for Deschutes County. By late November, the temperature had plummeted to 10 below zero, and a heavy, crystalline hoarfrost had locked the ponderosa pines in a silent, icy grip. The wood stove in my cabin roared constantly, the dry heat of burning juniper cracking the dry skin on my hands until they bled through my bandages. I became obsessed with keeping the fire hot, stacking split logs into the iron firebox until the cast iron sides glowed a dull, warning cherry red. I couldn't sleep unless the room was hot enough to scorch my throat. I was terrified of the cold. On the night of the solstice, the wind died down, leaving the mountain plateau in a state of absolute, freezing stagnation. I sat by the glowing stove, the old leather-bound registry of 1934 resting on my knees. The book had become my Bible, its singed pages a constant, physical reminder that the nightmare in the sub-basement hadn't been a carbon monoxide hallucination. I knew the truth. I knew what the state inspectors had covered up. As I turned the brittle pages, the air in the cabin suddenly went dead. The cheerful, snapping crackle of the juniper wood inside the stove died instantly. The flames didn't flicker out, they simply froze, their orange tongues locking in place behind the mica window like jagged glass teeth. The heat radiating from the iron stove vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a biting, chemical chill that smelled of old, wet charcoal and decayed wool. From the dark corner of the cabin, behind the dry sink, came a sound. Clang. It was the unmistakable, sharp impact of metal against copper. But there were no pipes in the cabin. The water line was a single, rubber hose that ran from an exterior well pump, and that had been drained and disconnected weeks ago. Asterisk clang. Clang, asterisk. The sound was vibrating out of the iron stove itself. I stood up, my knees trembling as the floorboards began to groan under the sudden, immense strain of the dropping temperature. The iron sides of the stove, which had been glowing red-hot only seconds before, were turning gray. A thin, white frost began to spiderweb across the cast iron door, creeping outward from the draft vents in delicate, geometric lines. The latch of the stove door began to vibrate. Asterisk thud. Thud. Thud, asterisk. With a dull, heavy metallic click, the iron latch lifted. The door swung open on its ungreased hinges, slamming against the stone hearth with a sound that echoed like a distant gunshot across the empty plateau. No smoke came out of the firebox. Instead, a dense, pressurized plume of white steam poured from the burning juniper logs, rolling across the wooden floorboards toward my bare feet. The steam was thick, opaque, and carrying the sibilant, dual-pulsed roar of the laundry presses, the mechanical heartbeat that had followed me down from the mountain. I backed away until my head hit the cold pine logs of the back wall. In the center of the rolling white mist, the geometric shapes began to weave themselves together once more. The towering, elongated torso of the entity rose toward the low ceiling, its featureless dome of fog tilting slowly as it located my heat in the freezing room. But this time, there were no concrete walls to contain it, and no iron boilers to trap its breath. The entity was no longer just the 64, it had integrated Miller, and now it was seeking the final, missing link of its closed loop. The white, pressurized limbs of vapor stretched outward, reaching across the small cabin toward my chest. As the cold air hit my face, my throat locked, my voice dying in a silent, frozen gasp as the first, wet shackle of frost wrapped around my ankles. The touch of the vapor wasn't just cold, it was an absolute absence of motion. When the first thin, braided line of white steam closed around my ankle, the sensation was so sharp and biting that it felt like a band of serrated iron being wrenched tight by a hydraulic cylinder. The skin beneath my wool socks didn't just freeze, it split, the sudden contraction of the tissue making a dry, paper-like sound that was instantly swallowed by the rising roar in the room. I tried to pull my leg back, to kick myself free of the grasp, but my joints had already locked. The cold was a physical concrete, pouring into the marrow of my bones and solidifying my blood before it could even carry the signal of pain back to my brain. The entity rose, its elongated torso scraping against the low pine rafters of the cabin ceiling. The dry timber of the ceiling didn't just frost over, the wood began to groan and warp, the moisture trapped deep within the pine grain freezing and expanding until the logs split with a succession of sharp, gunshot-like cracks. The sibilant roar in its chest, the rhythmic hiss-shuck of the laundry presses, was no longer a distant frequency. It was a physical vibration that rattled my ribcage, matching the erratic, terrified pounding of my heart until my pulse began to slow, forced into the same mechanical, dual-pulsed cadence of the sanatorium's primary boiler loop. Asterisk hiss-shuck. Hiss-shuck, asterisk. I could see the outlines of Miller within the shifting geometry of the steam. He wasn't a separate entity, his features were woven into the very fabric of the wet linen layers, his frozen, hollow-eyed face appearing for a fraction of a second in the swirling gray fog before being crushed back into the pressurized mass. The 64 weren't just a collection of souls anymore. They were a single, cohesive engine, a hydraulic collective that had spent 50 years learning how to breathe through copper, and now they were using my cabin as their cylinder. The second limb of vapor reached out from the mass, its fingers stretching with a fluid, spider-like deliberation toward my throat. "Please," I gasped, but the word didn't leave my lips. The air in my lungs had already been replaced by the dry, sulfurous condensation of the firebox. Every time I tried to inhale, my throat was coated in a thick layer of microscopic, frozen ash that turned my windpipe into a narrow, restricted valve. I could feel my lungs filling with a heavy, cold fluid, not water, but a dense, pressurized condensation that felt like liquid mercury settling in the bottom of my chest. My vision began to narrow, the warm amber glow of the freezing wood stove turning into a distant, pinprick star surrounded by a vast, expanding ring of absolute, glacial black. I looked down at my hands. The white bandages I had worn since St. Charles were starting to unravel, the cotton fibers stiffening and turning gray as they absorbed the moisture from the entity's breath. Beneath the cloth, my scarred, raw skin was turning a translucent, waxy blue. The silver-gray scars on my forearms, the old burns from the maintenance shafts, were glowing with a faint, phosphorescent white, matching the frozen condensation lines that spiderwebbed across the cabin's pine logs. The entity didn't strike. It didn't tear. It simply leaned forward, its featureless dome of fog pressing against my face. The smell of old carbolic acid, singed wool, and wet charcoal became absolute, filling my sinuses until I couldn't even smell my own fear. I felt my weight shifting, my feet losing their grip on the frozen floorboards as the white, pressurized ropes around my ankles began to draw me forward, pulling me toward the wide, dark mouth of the ironwood stove. The firebox of the stove was cold now, its interior a dark throat that seemed to stretch downward into the earth, far deeper than the 3-foot iron box should have allowed. Through the open door, I could hear the faint, echoing rumble of the sanatorium's sub-basement 60 miles away, the distant, rhythmic thump-thump of the return headers, waiting for the condensation to return to the collector. My hands, no longer obeying my will, reached out and gripped the frosted iron frame of the stove. The skin of my palms stuck instantly to the frozen metal, but I didn't feel the tear. I felt only the vibration. The copper veins of the world were calling, and my breath was the only fuel left to keep the pressure from falling. With a final, rattling exhale that turned into a perfect, geometric spiral of gray frost, I let the mist draw me into the dark. The transition into the dark throat of the wood stove did not end in fire. There was no smoke, no ash, or violent ignition. Instead, my descent was a slow, pressurized slide through a seamless copper conduit bored through the mountain plateau. The metal of the conduit was freezing, its surface polished to a mirror-like finish that left no purchase for my raw, bleeding fingers. I slipped downward through absolute dark, pulled by a magnetic vacuum at the Earth's center. I was no longer breathing air. My lungs had filled with the dense condensation of the loop, a cold, metallic fluid that circulated through my bronchial pathways with the rhythmic stroke of a piston. It didn't choke me, it sustained me, replacing my blood with a pressurized, sulfurous mixture of water and ash that kept my limbs from collapsing under the immense hydrostatic pressure of the shaft. The slide ended with a dull, ringing impact. I fell onto a wet, flat surface of rusted iron. The air around me was thick with the suffocating stench of antiseptics, carbolic wash, and the Swedish rot of Ward C. I dragged myself to my knees, joints groaning with a dry, metallic creak that sounded like a stuck valve forced open by a wrench. I looked up, eyes instantly adapting to the dim, amber emergency glow that illuminated the space. I was back. I was standing on the soot-stained concrete floor of the sub-basement, directly in front of the dark hull of boiler number 2. The iron firebox door was shut, but the steel latch was vibrating, the rivets along the seams groaning as if holding back a pressure exceeding 60 pounds per square inch. I looked down at my hands. The white bandages from St. Charles were gone, replaced by a thick, translucent layer of gray frost that had integrated into my skin. My fingernails were dark, the color of weathered copper, and when I flexed, I could hear the faint, high-pitched whistle of pressurized vapor escaping from my palms. I was no longer a visitor in this tomb, I was part of its plumbing. Behind me, the spiral stairs creaked. A figure was descending, movements stiff and mechanical. It was wearing a heavy, wool utility coat, the fabric stiffened by a thick layer of white ice. The head was tilted, the face pale and featureless under a mask of crystalline frost. Miller, I tried to say, but the sound that came out was not a name. It was a sharp, mechanical hiss-shuck, followed by the deep, bubbling rattle of 64 pairs of ruined lungs trying to clear themselves of fluid. The sound vibrated through the concrete floor, rising through the foundation to echo in the empty corridors of the wards above. Miller didn't answer. He took his place at the second coal bin, frozen, blue hands gripping a heavy steel shovel. He didn't look at me, his eyes were fixed on the vibrating door of boiler number 2, movement synchronized perfectly with the slow, dual-pulsed thud of the main steam header. I walked over to the control board. The analog gauges for boiler number 1 were dead, their needles resting at 0. But the gauges for boiler number 2 were spinning, the red indicators passing 90, 100, 120 pounds of pressure. The iron pipes along the ceiling were sweating, the green condensation dripping onto the concrete with the rapid, frantic beat of a running clock. I reached out and placed my hand on the manual blowdown valve. The brass was freezing, but it didn't burn. The cold was my cold now, the pressure my pressure. I threw my weight against the lever, pulling it down until the iron teeth of the valve locked into place. With a deafening, hydraulic roar, the steam lines of the sanatorium opened. The hot, sulfurous vapor didn't rise to the ceiling, it circulated downward, flowing through the floor drains and into the foundation, filling every crack and fracture in the concrete with a pressurized, living heat. I could feel the heat rising through my boots, a warm, tingling current of steam that carried the memories of the 64, the terror of Miller, and the long, freezing winter of 1934. Above us, the building began to respond. Through the concrete ceiling, I could hear the 70 patients of the recovery ward stirring, their shallow, fluid-filled breathing smoothing out as the warmth of the lower loop reached their rooms. They didn't know who was keeping them warm. They didn't know that every breath they drew of the dry, heated air was being paid for by the endless, circulating essence of the lost. I took my shovel and stepped beside Miller. The heavy iron door of boiler number 2 swung open once more, revealing a firebox that was no longer empty. It was filled with a brilliant, white-hot mass of shifting steam that turned our frost-covered skin into a glowing silver. We raised our shovels, our movements perfectly aligned as we began to feed the dark, greasy soot of the floor back into the throat of the engine, maintaining the pressure, keeping the loop closed, forever. The white-hot furnace of boiler number 2 sustained our cycle. With every shovelful of gray silt we threw into the glowing maw, the draft inside the chimney whistled a low, harmonic chord that vibrated in my copper-scaled feet. The heat in the firebox was a blinding paradox, a dry, incandescent vortex that looked like fire but felt like the crushing pressure of an Arctic trench. It was the physical manifestation of 64 winters, compressed into a space no larger than a shipping crate, and we were its engineers. Beside me, Miller moved with the efficiency of a steam-driven piston. His shovel bit into the dark ash, lifted, and swung in a 90-degree arc, depositing black grease into the white void. His frozen wool coat did not melt, the frost on his collar was a permanent structure, reflecting the firebox light like glass teeth. He was no longer Miller the night watchman, he was the left cylinder. I was the right. Above us, the network of copper headers began to sing. It was a metallic chorus that vibrated through the foundation, amplified 1,000 times. The steam wasn't just moving through the pipes, it was expanding at a rate that defied the physical volume of the metal. Every elbow, T-junction, and pressure reduction valve was shrieking under a load that was pushing the system toward a catastrophic rupture. I looked at the control board. The glass face of the pressure gauge had cracked, a single vertical fissure splitting the dial. Behind the glass, the needle had bent into a U-shape, forced past the maximum limit by an invisible, hydraulic weight. The system was choking. If the pressure didn't find a vent, the sub-basement would disintegrate. The concrete pillars would buckle under the explosive expansion of 80 years of trapped breath, collapsing the 3 floors above into a pile of rubble. The 70 patients sleeping in iron frames would be buried before they could draw a final, cold breath of the steam we were forcing into their rooms. I dropped my shovel, the heavy handle clattering against the concrete with a dull thud. I ran to the primary bypass manifold, a massive, 6-way junction of green-painted iron that sat behind the coal bins, control valved by a heavy brass will that had been rusted shut since the epidemic. Miller. I screamed, but the sound was nothing but a pressurized hiss of steam, a sharp hiss shuck that didn't carry. Miller didn't turn. His shovel rose, swung, and deposited another load of ash. His movements were locked into the mechanical cadence of the loop, deaf to the destruction of the facility he had spent his life guarding. I threw my weight against the bypass wheel. The cold brass bit into the frost of my palms, but I felt no pain, only the intense frequency of the steam trapped behind the valve seat. The metal didn't budge. The rust was too thick, a red crust of iron oxide that had fused the threads of the valve stem into an immovable block. I gripped the wheel with both hands, my feet slipping as I tried to force the stem to turn. Through the iron housing, I could hear the condensation rising. It was bubbling, a wild, violent turbulence of water and ash hitting the closed valve with the force of a sledgehammer. Thud. 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 The water hammer was starting. If the liquid condensation hit the valve head at full velocity, the shock wave would shatter the manifold, releasing a wave of boiling water that would strip the flesh from my bones. I looked back at the firebox. The silver-white light was flaring, the outlines of the 64 stretching toward the ceiling as the draft grew to an industrial scream. They didn't want the valve to open. They wanted the pressure to build. They wanted the entire facility to join them in the dark, to turn every living lung in the upper wards into a circulating loop of steam. With a final, desperate surge of strength, I reached for my heavy steel wrench. I swung the tool with both hands, bringing the flat of the iron head down onto the top of the valve stem with a wild, vertical stroke. Clang! The impact rang through the basement. The rust on the valve stem shattered, and the heavy brass will spun 3 full rotations to the left with a screaming hiss of escaping pressure. The primary bypass was open. The relief valve on the roof erupted, releasing a 500-foot column of white steam into the freezing night air. The pressure plummeted, the needles on the control board dropping back toward the safety zone with a slow, grinding sigh. Beside me, Miller's shovel stopped in midair. He stood frozen, head tilting toward the ceiling as the sibilant roar in his chest faded, replaced by the natural silence of the mountain night. The white-hot glare inside boiler number 2 dimmed to a soft, orange ember, the geometric shadows of the 64 receding back into the dark corners of the firebox, leaving us alone in the quiet dark. The silence that settled over the sub-basement wasn't the peaceful quiet of a storm passing, it was the heavy, breathless pause of a machine that had finally run out of water. The relief valve high on the slate roof of the sanatorium had stopped its screaming. 500 feet above our concrete bunker, the towering plume of white steam was drifting away into the pine-choked ridges of Mount Hood, dissolving into the freezing mountain air until not a single trace of our desperate vent remained. Beside me, Miller didn't drop his shovel. He simply stood there, his frozen hand still fused to the ash-stained steel handle, his head tilted upward toward the silent rafters. The crystalline frost on his eyelashes didn't melt, and the pale, translucent blue of his skin didn't fade back into the flush of a living man. He had become a permanent fixture of the room, as cold and unyielding as the iron pillar supporting the 3 floors of dying patients above us. I looked down at my own hands. The waxy, translucent frost had settled permanently beneath my skin, tracing the delicate network of my veins in faint, glowing lines of silver condensation. When I breathed, no warmth left my lips. There was only the dry, silent expansion of gray ash, a small, geometric spiral of vapor that rose toward the ceiling before dissolving into the darkness. The firebox of boiler number 2 had died down to a faint, resting ember. The brilliant, white-hot vortex of the 64 had receded deep into the iron belly of the furnace, leaving behind only a soft, orange glow that cast long, motionless shadows across the concrete floor. The geometric outlines of the patients were gone, pulled back into the closed loop of the copper pipes, waiting for the next deep freeze to call them back to the fire. We had balanced the pressure. For now, the system was stable. I walked slowly to the workbench, my boots no longer making a sound on the dry, gray silt. My movements were slow, governed by the heavy, hydraulic rhythm that had replaced the frantic beating of my heart. I picked up the old leather-bound registry of 1934. Its singed pages were dry now, the oily, black condensation having retreated back into the paper, leaving behind only the faded, cramped cursive of the old facility director. I carried the book to the auxiliary records cabinet behind the coal bins, a rusted steel locker that had been sealed since the year the mountain froze. I pulled the heavy latch open, the metal groaning in protest as the rusted hinges gave way. Inside, stacked in neat, vertical columns, were dozens of identical leather-bound volumes, their covers swollen with the dampness of a half-century of basement steam. Each book was labeled with a white, handwritten tag, the ink faded to a dry, yellow ghost of itself. 1942. 1956. 1968. I slid the 1934 registry into the empty slot at the end of the shelf, the leather cover fitting perfectly between the dusty volumes. As the book slid into place, a faint, rhythmic tapping started up from the pipe chase behind the cabinet. Clang. It was a single, soft stroke. A gentle, administrative confirmation. The ledger was closed. The units had been accounted for. I shut the steel cabinet door and locked the heavy latch. When I turned back to the room, the emergency lanterns were beginning to fade, their battery reserves finally dying after the long, freezing night. The yellow, amber glow shrank until it was nothing but a thin, horizontal line on the concrete floor, leaving the sub-basement in a state of absolute, velvet blackness. But I didn't need the light anymore. I could feel the entire layout of the sanatorium through the soles of my feet. I could feel the cold water in the gravity return lines, the slow, sluggish flow of the condensation settling in the main headers, and the faint, shallow breathing of the 70 patients sleeping in their iron beds 3 floors above. They were warm now. Their rooms were filled with the dry, circulating heat of the lower loop, a silent comfort paid for by the endless, rotating labor of the dead. I walked back to the coal bin and took my place beside Miller. The winter of 1976 would eventually yield to the spring thaw, and the corporate legal teams and state inspectors would continue to draft their neat, professional reports about cracked flues and carbon monoxide levels. They would look at the empty chairs, the missing watchmen, and the closed doors, and they would write down words like liability and accidental exposure. They would never understand that a building is more than just concrete and timber. They would never understand that some engines require a fuel that cannot be bought with money. We stood together in the dark, our shovels ready, our lungs silent, waiting for the thermometer on the north wall to drop below 32 degrees once more. The mountain was quiet, the loop was closed, and we were the cold reserve, keeping the pressure steady until the end of time.